My husband, a renowned doctor, tells everyone I'm losing my memory due to early-onset dementia. After a hidden camera catches him switching my pills, I realize he's trying to trigger the same condition that killed my wealthy mother to claim her estate. My husband, Arthur, is a man the world adores. A brilliant doctor who spends his days saving lives while spending his nights convinced I'm losing mine. I sat frozen at our dinner table as he held my hand and told our guests, with a voice full of tragic grace, that I was slipping into the same dark fog of dementia that claimed my mother. He looks at me with such rehearsed pity that even I started to believe my own mind was rotting, until I saw the truth hidden in the shadows of our kitchen. I caught him on a secret camera, his steady surgeon's hands carefully swapping my daily medication for something meant to destroy me. Arthur isn't trying to save me. He is methodically erasing me to get his hands on my mother's fortune. And now the woman he thinks is helpless is the one watching his every move. The chandelier above our dining table cast a sharp, unforgiving light on the faces of our guests. We were hosting the Millers, and the light chatter of a successful evening filled the room, but I felt a strange, cold prickle at the back of my neck. Arthur, looking every bit the respected chief of medicine in his navy blazer, leaned back and swirled his wine. He waited for a lull in the conversation, his eyes tracking the movement of my fork with a clinical intensity. He reached over and placed his hand over mine, squeezing just enough to keep me from pulling away. "It's the little things that hurt the most, isn't it, Diane?" he said, his voice dripping with a practiced, honeyed sorrow. He turned to the Millers, his expression shifting into a mask of weary endurance. "I came downstairs this morning with a bouquet of lilies, your absolute favorite, and you just stared at them. You asked me why I was bringing funeral flowers into the house on a random Tuesday." I froze. The piece of roasted asparagus on my plate suddenly looked blurred. "Arthur, I didn't see any lilies this morning," I stammered, my face heating up as Sarah Miller lowered her wine glass. Her expression shifted from a smile to a look of profound, uncomfortable pity. "See," Arthur sighed, turning to our guests with a saintly smile. "She's already pushed the moment out. Today is our 35th anniversary and my poor Diane has no recollection of it. I'm not angry, of course. How can you be angry at a fading mind? It just breaks my heart to see the woman I love slipping away into the mist." The room went silent. I searched my brain, clawing through the drawers of my memory, but there was nothing there. No lilies. No anniversary cards. Just a vast, terrifying blank space. I looked at the pitying eyes around the table and felt a deep sense of shame. If a man as brilliant as Arthur said it happened, then surely it must have. He was the doctor after all. The weight of my mother's ghost seemed to settle onto my shoulders as I watched our guests leave. I remembered her final years with a clarity that hurt. She had been a vibrant, wealthy woman who managed an entire estate, and then almost overnight she became a shell. I recalled a morning just last week in my own garden. The air was crisp and the smell of damp earth usually grounded me. I had planted every rose bush in this yard with my own hands. But as I reached the edge of the koi pond, a wave of vertigo washed over me. The familiar gravel path suddenly looked like a foreign labyrinth. I turned around trying to find the back porch, but the house seemed to have shifted. I wandered in circles for 10 minutes in a space no larger than a quarter acre, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. When I finally found the door, I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, sobbing. I was terrified that I was fated to follow her dark path. Then the domestic inconsistencies began to pile up like unwashed laundry. One afternoon I spent 3 hours looking for my reading glasses. I checked the bedside table 5 times. I checked the bathroom and the refrigerator. I eventually gave up and sat down to rest. 10 minutes later, Arthur walked into the room, reached onto the very bedside table I had cleared off and held up the glasses. "Darling, they were right here," he said, his voice soft and patronizing. "You really need to try harder to focus. It's getting worse, Diane." Later that evening I found a notepad by the telephone. There was a list of groceries written in my own handwriting. Milk, eggs, flour, and then a word that made my blood run cold. Arsenic. I would never write that. I stared at the loops of the letters. It was my hand, but I had no memory of the thought. It felt like someone was rewriting my life while I was still living it. Every morning the ritual was the same. Arthur would bring me a small silver tray with a glass of lukewarm water and a translucent orange pill. "For your memory, sweetheart," he'd say, standing over me to ensure I swallowed. Within 30 minutes of taking it, a heavy metallic taste would coat my tongue. Felt like my brain was being wrapped in thick wet wool. I would try to read the morning paper, but the letters would dance and hop off the page. I would try to knit, but the needles felt like lead weights. I spent most of my days in a hazy stupor in the sunroom, feeling my spark fade away under his watchful, caring eyes. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, a silent witness to my own decline, while Arthur managed the household accounts with newfound vigor. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday during a trip to the local pharmacy. I bumped into Mrs. Gable, an old family friend who had been a nurse at the clinic where my mother was treated. She looked at me with a mixture of shock and concern, pulling me into the aisle between the vitamins and the bandages. "Diane, you look just like your mother did at the end," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the door. "It's such a tragedy." She was so sharp, right up until the day Arthur took over her prescriptions. It happened so fast after that. Within 2 months she didn't even know her own name. I always thought it was strange, how her health only declined once he took charge of her special vitamins. Her words didn't just rattle me, they acted like a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was there. My mother hadn't been sick for years. She had been sick for a very specific window of time, the exact same window of time I was currently living through. A cold, hard spark of anger began to burn through the fog in my mind. I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I drove to a hardware store 2 towns over. I bought a small, unassuming digital alarm clock with a hidden high-definition lens. When I got home, I waited for Arthur to go for his evening jog. With trembling hands, I set the clock on the kitchen counter, angling it perfectly toward the area where he prepared my daily pill organizer. I hid the packaging in the bottom of the outdoor trash bin. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Arthur's rhythmic breathing, I didn't feel like a patient anymore. I felt like a hunter. I was no longer waiting to lose my mind. I was waiting for the truth to be caught on film. The house was deathly silent, save for the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the central heating and the heavy, synchronized breathing of a man who slept with the clear conscience of a saint. I remained perfectly still in the darkness of the guest room, my thumb hovering over the play button on my tablet. I had pulled the heavy duvet over my head, creating a stifling nylon tent to ensure not a single stray beam of light would betray me if Arthur happened to wake. When I finally pressed play, the black and white footage from the kitchen clock camera flickered to life. The time stamp read 11:42 p.m. There he was. Arthur walked into the kitchen wearing his favorite silk robe, the one I had bought him for Christmas. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, he didn't need to. He moved with the practiced ease of a predator in its own den. I watched, my breath hitching in my throat as he pulled my weekly pill organizer from the cabinet. Then he reached behind the decorative flower canisters, a spot I hadn't cleaned in months, and pulled out a small amber glass vial. With a steady hand that showed no tremor of guilt, he began to work. He used a pair of fine tweezers to open my prescribed heart capsules, tapping out the white beads and replacing them with a dull, gray powder from his secret vial. He repeated the process for every single day of the week. He wasn't just a doctor anymore, he was a chemist of my destruction. Seeing his calm, focused face on that screen felt like a physical coldness spreading through my veins. The man I had loved for half my life wasn't fighting my illness. He was meticulously manufacturing it. The next morning arrived with a cruel, bright sun that felt like a mockery of my internal state. I heard Arthur's footsteps on the stairs, the familiar, heavy tread that used to bring me comfort but now sounded like a death knell. He entered the room with that same silver tray, the orange juice pulpy and fresh, and that one tainted capsule sitting in the center of the dish. "Morning, sunshine," he chirped, setting the tray on my lap and brushing a stray hair from my forehead. "You look a bit pale today. Did you have those bad dreams again?" I had to be perfect. If he saw even a flicker of the fire burning in my gut, I was finished. I forced my muscles to go limp, letting my lower lip tremble just a fraction. "Just a little tired, Arthur," I whispered, keeping my eyes unfocused as if I were struggling to ground myself in reality. I picked up the pill, feeling its weight like a lead bullet. As I raised the water glass to my lips, I used the edge of the rim to shield the movement of my thumb, sliding the capsule into the pocket of my cheek while making a loud, exaggerated gulping sound. "There's a good girl," he murmured, patting my hand before taking the empty tray. The moment the door clicked shut, I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran to the bookshelf and pulled down an old leather-bound copy of Great Expectations that I had hollowed out with a kitchen knife the day before. I spat the pill into the cavity, watching it roll among the dozens of others I had already salvaged. Every time I looked him in the eye and thanked him for his patience, a piece of my soul felt like it was turning to stone, but I knew my survival depended on this masquerade. The opportunity one needed came 2 days later when Arthur called to say he had an emergency surgery that would keep him at the hospital until late evening. As soon as his car cleared the driveway, I flew into his private study. It was a room I rarely entered, filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and old paper. I went straight for the mahogany desk, my hands shaking as I tried the drawers. The bottom right drawer was locked, but I knew Arthur, he was a man of habit. I reached under the rim of the desk and felt the small magnetic key holder he thought was so clever. Inside the drawer sat a black leather briefcase. When I pried it open, I didn't find medical journals or hospital budgets. I found my mother's original will, the one that should have been in the safety deposit box at the bank. Attached to it were several authorization of representation forms. I scanned them, my eyes stinging as I recognized my own signature at the bottom, or at least, a terrifyingly accurate forgery of it. The documents were dated for the end of this month. A shudder went through me as I read the fine print. He was petitioning the court for full conservatorship based on documented cognitive decline and habitual hallucinatory episodes. There was a memo from our accountant about a new inheritance tax law taking effect on the 1st of next month. Arthur wasn't just trying to kill me, he was on a deadline. He needed me legally erased before the government could take a larger bite of my mother's estate. I knew I couldn't stay in that house a second longer without some form of outside validation. I gathered my coat and drove 40 miles to a small independent pharmacy in a neighboring county where nobody knew the illustrious Dr. Arthur. I walked up to the counter, my voice barely a whisper as I spoke to a silver-haired man whose name tag read Elias. I handed him one of the gray powder capsules. My husband was prescribed these for his nerves. I lied, my throat tight. But he's been acting so strange, aggressive. I just need to know what's in them before I let him take any more. Elias took the pill to the back. The 20 minutes I spent waiting, staring at a display of greeting cards, felt like 20 years. When he returned, he wasn't smiling. He beckoned me into a small, private consultation room. "Ma'am, where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't a nerve pill. It's a concentrated compound of scopolamine mixed with a high-dose sedative. In these amounts, it creates a state of twilight sleep. It makes a person suggestible, causes massive memory gaps, and over time it will cause permanent, irreversible brain damage. If someone is taking this daily, they aren't just being medicated, they're being dismantled." I walked out of that pharmacy into the cold rain, the truth finally solidified. I wasn't a woman losing her mind. I was a woman being murdered in plain sight. The drive home was a blur of rage and clarity. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the fear had been replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I was done being the prey. If Arthur wanted a woman who was losing her grip on reality, I would give him exactly what he wanted, and I would make it so convincing that he would walk right into my trap. I went to my vanity and purposefully smeared my eyeliner, making myself look haggard and distraught. I pulled out my diary and left it open on the kitchen island, a place I knew he checked every evening when he thought I wasn't looking. In a frantic, shaky script I wrote, "The lady in the red dress was in the kitchen again today. She told me Arthur is hiding the gold in the basement." I tried to follow her, but the floor turned into water. I stepped back, looking at the entry. It was the perfect bait. I wanted him to see this and believe his plan was accelerating. I wanted him to feel that surge of arrogant triumph that would make him stop looking over his shoulder. As I heard his car pull into the garage, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a wall, waiting for my loving husband to come home and check on his poor, sick wife. The game was no longer about survival. It was about the slow, deliberate sharpening of the knife I was about to twist. I heard the heavy click of Arthur's wingtips on the hardwood floor as he entered the kitchen. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty wall, my expression vacant, playing the part of the broken woman he had worked so hard to create. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him spot the open diary on the counter. He paused, his gaze scanning my frantic fake handwriting about the lady in the red dress. A slow, satisfied smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a look of predatory victory he usually reserved for successful board meetings. He thought he had won. He thought the finish line was in sight. "Diane, darling," he said, his voice a silky caress as he walked behind me, placing his hands on my shoulders. I felt a visceral surge of revulsion, but I forced myself to remain limp. You seem particularly far away tonight. But don't worry. I haven't forgotten what night it is. 35 years. We should celebrate, shouldn't we? Just the two of us before you get too tired. He moved to the crystal decanter on the sideboard. I watched his reflection in the darkened window pane. He was meticulous, pouring 2 glasses of our finest vintage port. I saw his hand dip into the pocket of his blazer, pulling out a small vial, not the usual gray powder but a clear liquid this time. A special celebratory drink to finalize my descent. He stirred it with a silver stirrer, the clinking sound echoing like a tolling bell in the silent room. He carried the glasses over to the small candlelit table he had prepared, his eyes shining with a terrifying clinical brightness. To us, he whispered, sliding the spiked glass toward me. And to a long, peaceful rest. I picked up the glass, the crystal cold against my palm. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the monster behind the medical degree. Arthur, I said softly, my voice devoid of its usual tremor. Do you remember the night my mother died? She looked at you with such trust. She thought you were her savior. The smirk flickered. She was very ill, Diane. Like you. Let's not dwell on the past. I was just thinking about the medicine you gave her, I continued, leaning forward. Did she taste the metal too? Did the walls start to turn into water for her, or was her fog different than mine? His face went rigid. The clinical detachment he used as armor began to crack, a look of genuine confusion crossing his features. He wasn't used to me speaking with such clarity. You're rambling, Diane. The confusion is setting in. Drink your wine. It will help you sleep. At that exact moment, the landline in the hallway began to ring. A sharp, jarring intrusion. I'll get it, I said, half rising. No, stay put. I'll handle it, Arthur snapped, his irritation getting the better of his saintly persona. He stood up and hurried into the hall to silence the noise. It was a call I knew would come. A telemarketing bot I had scheduled to dial our number at exactly 8:15 p.m. I didn't waste a second. With the steady hands of a woman who had found her soul again, I swapped our glasses. When he returned 10 seconds later, looking annoyed, I was sitting exactly as he had left me, my hand resting near the stem of the now safe glass. Just a wrong number, he muttered, sitting back down. He grabbed his glass, the one he had prepared for me, and took a long, deep swallow as if to settle his nerves. I watched him. I watched the liquid disappear down his throat. I took a tiny, cautious sip of my own, my eyes never leaving his. The transition was faster than I expected. Within 5 minutes, Arthur's pupils began to dilate. He tried to reach for a piece of cheese, but his hand swiped clumsily across the tablecloth, knocking over the salt shaker. He blinked, shaking his head as if trying to clear a thick web. The lights, he mumbled, his voice thick and slurred. Why are the lights so dim? The lights are fine, Arthur, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and razor-sharp. I pushed my chair back and stood up, watching him slump forward. The doctor was disappearing, replaced by a man who looked small, frightened, and utterly pathetic. How does it feel? The heaviness. The way your thoughts are spinning away from you. It's a bit different when you aren't the one holding the syringe, isn't it? He tried to stand, his legs buckling beneath him. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white. What did you do? He wheezed, his face twisting into a mask of impotent rage. I didn't answer with words. I walked over to the kitchen clock, twisted the frame, and pulled out the memory card. I held it up before his fading eyes. Then I walked to the front door and threw it wide open. 2 blue and white cruisers were already pulling into the driveway, their silent lights painting the trees in rhythmic flashes of red and blue. Behind them was a black sedan carrying 2 representatives from the state medical board. Men Arthur had known for years, men who looked at him now with a mixture of horror and disgust. I had spent the last 48 hours sending them copies of the footage and the pharmacist's report. As the officers entered the room, Arthur tried to put on his mask one last time. Help, he gasped, pointing a trembling finger at me. She's lost it. She poisoned me. But the officer didn't look at me. He looked at the bag of swapped pills I produced from the hollowed-out book and the forged estate papers I laid out on the counter. The look on Arthur's face when he realized his perfect crime had been broadcast to the very people who held his license was a sight I will carry to my grave. It wasn't just defeat, it was the total annihilation of his ego. They let him out in handcuffs, his silk robe flapping in the wind, a broken man who had finally run out of medicine. The months that followed were a whirlwind of depositions and courtrooms, but for the first time in years the air felt clean. The legal battle to reclaim my mother's estate was grueling, but with the video evidence and Arthur's own journals, which the police found hidden in his wall safe, the truth was undeniable. I cleared her name. I proved that she wasn't a victim of nature, but a victim of a man's bottomless greed. I remember the day the final papers were signed. I went back to my mother's garden. The fog was gone, replaced by a sharp, vivid reality. I stood by the koi pond, the same spot where I had once been lost and terrified. The gravel path didn't look like a labyrinth anymore. It looked like a way home. I realized then that Arthur hadn't just been stealing my money. He had been stealing my time, my confidence, and my connection to the world. I walked back into the house and stood before the hallway mirror. I didn't see a fading woman or a victim of early-onset dementia. I saw a survivor. My hair was grayer and there were new lines around my eyes, but those eyes were sharp, alert, and full of a fire that no chemical could ever extinguish. I am 68 years old, I am incredibly wealthy, and for the first time in my life I am truly the master of my own mind. I picked up the silver tray Arthur used to carry and threw it into the trash bin. I walked to the window, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. I am not a frail woman to be discarded. I am the woman who stayed awake in the dark, and now I am going to enjoy the light.